On behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to the webinar on Agile testing challenges 4 years later. I'm Rex Black. I'm president of RBCS. We are a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm, clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. We have been around since 1994, delivering insight and confidence to hundreds of clients worldwide. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services to companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 10 books on software testing, and I won't bore you with all the titles, but some of the highlights are Managing the Testing Process and the new and increasingly popular ebook, Testing Metrics, with a couple other ebooks on improving the testing process and improving the software process. We're presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. Check out their website, www.softwaretestpro.com. And if you happen to show up for their conference in October, attend one of the pre-conference tutorials, hope you'll stop by mine, and we'll be giving a presentation on testing metrics, including a very interesting case study from a client of ours. We'll be talking about their core 4 test reporting metrics. Interesting stuff. Today's webinar might earn you credit for QAI and or ASQ recertification. You'll need to check with them to determine how to qualify. Definitely, if you're trying to get any sort of continuing education credit, save that attendee webinar, attendee email that you're going to get from GoToWebinar after this webinar. Today's webinar will get you PMI PDUs if you need those. And thank you to Rex Price for reviewing the materials and for making valuable suggestions. Go to pmi.org to claim the PDUs and use code ATC100. RBCS's provider ID is 2986. Please note that the PDUs are available for webinar attendance only. You cannot listen to the recorded webinars and claim the PDUs. Before we start the presentation, some housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, submit them at any time, but note that I only look at them at the end, so if you ask me a question in the middle, I won't be able to get to it until the end of the event. Presentation is posted on the web. Go to rbcs-us.com, and in the Resources tab at the upper middle, navigate to the basic library. You will find the PDF version there. Also, by attending this webinar, you've been automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing, so watch your email over the next couple days. If you are having any problems with the audio or visual components of this webinar, contact GoToWebinar support. Most of the time, problems are either browser incompatibility, somebody's trying to use a browser that won't work with GoToWebinar, company firewalls, so your firewall won't allow you to download the webinar software, or the audio settings on your PC. So those tend to be the big three. You can start with those. So I hope you enjoy this free webinar. This is a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. Now, today's presentation is on Agile testing challenges. A few months ago I gave a webinar on Agile testing opportunities, and I mentioned the Agile testing challenges presentation, and somebody said, hey, you should update that and give it again. So I am. In fact, yesterday I did the presentation on Agile testing opportunities as well. Had some interesting discussions. Maybe some of you caught that. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is the challenges that arise with Agile. And this is an updated version of a presentation I had given a number of years ago initially, and it's based on experience with RBCS clients over the last few years. Organizations are using Agile. Now, I want to be clear before I get into this that I'm talking about challenges from Agile as actually practiced in organizations that we've worked with or talked to people that work there. This is not necessarily as intended. So I had an interesting opportunity to listen to Alistair Cockburn and talk to him actually in Kiev over the weekend at the Weekend IT conference. It was there in Kiev, which was a great conference, by the way. Anyway, he was talking about Agile and some of the things that I'm going to mention. He's just like, oh no, that shouldn't happen. But unfortunately, it does. So I just want to be clear for those of you who might be Agile purists and say, oh, well, this is what you're talking about, that's not supposed to happen. I agree. In many cases, these things are not supposed to happen, but unfortunately they do. And in testing, we have to play the hand we're dealt, and that includes a perhaps improper implementation of the life cycle, which is not unusual anyway. I mean, that is always the case with sequential life cycles. The theory was in the V model that the test team would be involved early, and we'd be testing the requirements by building test cases against them and all of that happy jazz. And the frequency with which that happened was, vanishingly small, really, compared to the sort of the test team gets involved at the last minute, minimal time to prepare, and so forth. So, lest it seem like I'm picking on Agile here, I just want to be clear that it's not. This is just people are human and they're fallible. They make mistakes, and those mistakes can have implications for the test team. So, Agile life cycles are becoming very common. In the webinar yesterday, we had I think it was about 200 some people, and most of those people were on projects where the Agile was currently being used. It does seem to be a very common kind of approach. Now, one of the things that's important when you're working with any life cycle is that you pick a test strategy that will fit into that life cycle. And what we've seen work well in Agile methodologies is one is risk-based testing. Another is the use of automated testing, including using functional regression test techniques, open source tools like Selenium, for example, Fitness, and reactive testing techniques like checklist-based testing and Whitaker's attacks technique and exploratory testing and so forth, used to kind of fill in gaps in the more structured type of testing. Other types of strategies like purely requirements-based strategies don't tend to work as well, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. Now, I do want to be clear, when I say risk-based testing, that's a phrase that people use to mean a number of different things. I'm talking about risk-based testing as I mean risk-based testing, and if anybody's curious about, well, what exactly would that be like, there's plenty of articles and recorded webinars and so forth available on the basic library, the advanced library, the digital library, and the articles page of our website that will explain what I mean by risk-based testing. But I don't mean, for example, risk-based testing as explained by some people where you just do a analysis of the requirement specification and put risk ratings on the requirement specs. That's not risk-based testing. That's risk-weighted requirements-based testing, and that will not work very well in an Agile world for reasons that will be clear as I go along. Now, picking the right strategy is definitely important, but picking the right strategy is not going to solve all of your problems. And I want to make sure that as we go along that you see how some of these things still have additional challenges that need to be confronted. But definitely picking the right strategies is necessary, because if you pick a strategy that's got preconditions contrary to the basic operating assumptions of Agile, you're just going to be in no shortage of problems coming along, and you'd be basically defining yourself as crossways to the purposes of the organization and the methodology. But if you pick these three strategies as your primary testing strategies, those will be well aligned with Agile and will set you up to confront some of these other challenges. So let's take a look at them. The first one, which I think is the thing that kind of shocks everybody when they're first in an Agile or an Agile-like environment, is the volume and the speed of change. This arises from a basic Agile principle that says that you should welcome changing requirements even if they happen late in development. And by the way, I'm going to quote these Agile principles from time to time. This all comes from the Agile Manifesto, which can be found on the internet. So there's going to be change in Agile. It's inherent, and part of doing Agile properly is handling that change properly, and it's handled through these short iterations that mean that we're able to revise and expand the definition of the product really at any time, and in the beginning of any one of these 2-week iterations. Now, risk-based testing is a good fit for that, because the way that we set this up with clients that want to do risk-based testing in an Agile world is you simply do a risk analysis as part of the process of defining the user stories for that iteration. And each user story gets examined for a risk implications, and then you also need to do a systemic quality risk analysis too, as part of the looking at the overall content of the sprint. And you use lightweight documentation techniques for your risk analysis, and then test based on risk, as usually the case. The use of automation is also important in this context, but you have to be very careful. You have to make sure that your automation approach, the architecture of your automation and so forth, is able to accommodate change. You don't want to be in a situation where your automation is creating barriers to the speed of change, because again, that's something that ends up getting you crossways with the basic assumptions of Agile methodologies. And again, the lightweight reactive testing is good because, in reactive testing, we react to the system as it's actually presented to us, rather than doing a lot of upfront analysis and trying to figure out what to test in advance. And so that's that's also something that that works very well. Now, that said, that again will not completely resolve all of your problems. Because the definition of the product and what constitutes correct behavior for it is something that's constantly evolving, and it's important that the test team, be kept informed of that. We've had clients tell us stories about two people meet in a hallway and have a quick face-to-face conversation and decide to change something, and then that information does not get transmitted to the testing organization, and that's then of course a problem, because the testers are testing based on a misconception of what the product is supposed to do, an outdated conception of what the product is supposed to do. The other thing too that is important here is that change can affect testing differently than it affects development. So the amount of work associated with a particular change might or might not be the same or similar for testing and development, and it's important that the process of evaluating the changes, sizing changes, and this applies to sprint estimation as well, include testing and helping people understand this is what it takes to test something thoroughly, a particular change or user story or so forth. Without this kind of careful management of the change, what we find is that there's a fair number of testing inefficiencies that are created by this rapid change. So it is manageable, but just you have to make sure that that it is being managed, and the test team's in the loop, and the impact on test is considered. Now, another thing that's a challenge for a number of our clients is the issue of being effective in very short iterations. So, ideal case, a sequential life cycle like a V model, you would have a lengthy period prior to test execution where you could develop tests, and then, as part of the closure period after a project, you could maintain the tests. The effort gets kind of taken off the critical path, in the sense it's not during test execution, and that's also true even in some iterative life cycles like RUP and RAD that iterate but more slowly. Now, in Agile methodology, you're typically looking at anywhere from 2 to 4 week sprints, so it seems like almost everybody's moving to the 2-week sprint approach. This really gives the test team very little time to develop tests and to maintain tests, and this particularly can be an issue with test automation. So as I said, if you're testing through the graphical user interface, make sure that you very carefully architected your automation for maintenance, maintainability. Techniques like keyword-based test automation seem to do reasonably well here, but again, be careful. Also, what we found is that it's good to have the people responsible for developing and maintaining the automation framework itself to be working outside of the sprint, which will be something I'll get back to a little bit later. Now, risk-based testing is definitely helpful here in dealing with this because, you know, efficiency and focus is key when you're very time constrained. So you want to make sure that from a point of view of developing, maintaining, and executing the tests that you're looking at, you know, what's the most important thing, what should we focus on. The risk analysis can really help with that. In the absence of a risk analysis, it can be easy to kind of misuse the limited testing time that's available, and because it's so limited, there's very little time to catch up should a problem arise. Now, unit testing. You know, one of the things that's great about Agile in the way it's being promoted is that there's a lot of emphasis on unit testing, and not just unit testing, but automated unit testing. But in the practical world, what we're seeing is two problems. One is, and this is pretty much universal, unit testing tends to find about 25 to 30% of the bugs that are present can be found at that time. According to Capers-Jones's studies, even the best done unit testing seems to top out somewhere in the 50 to 60% range, which is still well below what we see when we do assessments of independent test teams, which tend to average around 85%. And some of the independent test teams we've looked at, their defect detection effectiveness can be as high as 95 or 99%. So, you know, you have to be careful not to over-rely on unit testing given that limitation. Now, the other thing is that some organizations have not really gotten the message or pushed the message down to the programmer. So we've heard a lot of rationalizations from programmers about why, yeah, unit testing is great, but that doesn't apply to my stuff because of X. One of the common excuses is, well, my code is too tightly coupled and it's legacy code, and I don't have time to refactor it and to remove the tight coupling, etc. Well, you know, be that as it may, I mean that may be a perfectly reasonable excuse, but that then means that every defect that's introduced during programming has to be detected and removed during these very short test execution periods. So that's a real issue, and you know, seriously complicates the ability to successfully carry out testing in an Agile space if that step gets skipped. So unit testing definitely needs to be done to try to control the number of defects getting into that very short test execution period. But at the same time, we also need to be very realistic that unit testing by itself is not going to be enough. Now, another thing, another challenge is, you know, when you say embrace change and be ready to change things frequently and refactor a lot, et cetera, that means that you're going to have regression risk because code that was working in a previous sprint is going to be hammered by the change, right? Potentially regressed. Now, the usual story, I guess, the usual response that you will hear from an Agile promoter in this situation is, well, that's fine because we've got, you know, all of these automated unit tests that we created during test-driven development, and we just rerun those anytime we refactor, and that eliminates the regression risk. Well, that of course is a very optimistic way of thinking. For one thing, you can never eliminate risk. Risk can only be managed and brought down to an acceptable level, and it's not eliminated. The other thing is, again, thinking that, you know, at best we're getting 50% of the regression defects in our unit tests. That means that half of the regression defects are going to slip past. So there needs to be some sort of automated regression testing that's happening, you know, at a system level using tools such as Fitness and Selenium and other maybe commercial tools, as well as using risk-based testing to make sure that we're doing, you know, proper impact analysis on the change and thinking about where's the regression risk particularly high, because you might need to augment your automated regression test with manual regression tests for particular changes. And then, as I said before, make sure that you've got a team, and this could be a team of one, but you have people outside of the sprint that are focused on just making sure that all of the supporting elements, the frameworks and so forth, for the automation are there, and that they're actively supporting people within the sprints that are doing the automation. We've seen clients be successful with this approach, so I highly recommend it. Those clients that are trying to sort of shoehorn into the sprints the building of these frameworks, that's not been so successful because the teams are supposed to be focused on things that are, associated with getting the sprint done. And when you're, working on creating an automated regression testing framework, that's provides long-term benefits, of course, but in the immediate term, it's not something that's focused on the sprint. Now, here's another challenge. This is definitely a challenge of Agile as implemented as opposed to Agile as conceived, Agile as intended. We see situations where people say, oh, well, Agile principles emphasize running software over complete documentation. Therefore, Agile means no documentation. That's not what that says. It doesn't say don't document anything. It's basically saying that, write down what you need to write down in order to get working software, and don't write down more than that. And one of the things that you need to have working software is to be able to recognize whether it's working or not. So that means that there needs to be sufficient information given to the test team to provide what's referred to in the trade as a test oracle. A test oracle is the thing to which you refer that tells you whether your test is passed or failed. But some of our clients, because of this Manichean interpretation of the Agile principle and with respect to documentation, and then their interpretation of it of no documentation is what's intended, then the testers will not have sufficient oracles, and you get a lot of problems with deciding whether a test is passed or failed. Now, even in situations where the test team does receive adequate test oracles, you have to be careful with this change, as I was discussing before, because if you've got change that's not being communicated to the testers, an oracle that's wrong because of a change is just as bad as an oracle that you don't have. In fact, in some ways, it's almost worse, because in one case you know you have a hole in your knowledge, and in the other case you don't. Now, another principle of Agile of conveying information in terms of face-to-face conversations, if the tests have already been created and test execution has started and testers are not told, or the testers are told after they've run a test and it's failed, the damage is basically done, right? The inefficiency has occurred, and these inefficiencies can be pretty significant. We've seen, organizations that have test oracle problems. The inefficiency on testing is, and this is an amazing number, but it's true, it's 20 to 30% of the overall effort. So, that's a real hit. Also, not only do you tend to have a higher rate of false positives, in other words, reporting things as failures when actually the software is working properly, you just weren't told what working properly was. The other thing that happens is you get false negatives. You start missing problems. Maybe the definition of correct behavior was changed, the code change wasn't implemented completely, and so the behavior is still what the outdated documentation says. The user story that was never updated says that something's supposed to work a certain way, and it does, but then the change is it's not supposed to work that way anymore. So your defect detection effectiveness can go down, and it also just can create a lot of frustration for the testers. And you're trying to operate in an environment where it's very difficult to say whether your tests are passing or failing. It's just a frustrating feeling, and that, from a test management point of view, creates a tremendous morale risk. So this definitely is something that needs to be dealt with, is that people need to understand that yes, it's good to be lightweight in documentation, and everybody wants to be efficient and not write down reams and reams of stuff. But at the same time, sufficient information has to be transmitted to the testers in order for them to do their job. And you're not giving somebody the information they need to do their job. That's definitely not Agile. Now, because things are changing, and because the requirements are often incomplete, the user stories are not necessarily kept up to date. This is why I said earlier the requirements-based testing strategies were a particularly bad choice in Agile life cycles, because what tends to happen is that you're constantly trying to chase after something that's shifting and shifting and shifting if you're following a purely requirements-based approach. And you're also, in a purely requirements-based approach, you would be measuring your coverage in terms of the requirements that were covered, and that can that can also create a problem if these user stories are constantly changing. Now, in the case of risk-based testing, what we can do is we use the user stories as an input to the risk analysis, as I mentioned before, and then the risks is our test basis, and our coverage analysis is done in terms of the risks that are covered, and what level of risk mitigation has been achieved based on the testing. So this helps deal with this sort of weak spot in requirements-based testing, purely requirements-based testing, that the organizations that are still trying to follow a purely requirements-based approach tend to run into. Excuse me. Now, meetings. This is definitely another thing where it's Agile as practiced versus Agile as conceived. So in listening to Alistair Cockburn give his talk over the weekend, he mentioned this very point. He said that sometimes organizations come to him and say, well, Agile's is great, but there's too many meetings, and then he's like, well, what? And too many meetings. There's supposed to be one meeting every day. It's supposed to be a stand-up meeting in the morning, last 10 or 15 minutes. And he said, if you get to the point where their stand-up meetings are lasting more than 10, 15 minutes, make them stand on one leg meeting, and people actually have to stand on one leg and see how long the meetings last. Which is, it's good. That's funny. I like the image of a bunch of people standing around trying to stand on one leg and talk about a software project. But and the reality is what we see a lot of is since there's not a lot of documentation, in some cases there's virtually none, and since Agile talks about face-to-face communication being the most efficient way to convey information, sometimes that is used as a pretext for having a lot more meetings, which, of course, in terms of the leads and managers, really reduces their effectiveness and efficiency, because we have one client tell us about how their test leads, their test managers, their development leads, development managers, BA leads and managers and so forth, they were in meetings like half of their day. So you can't manage your team, particularly in this sort of self-directed team type of approach. You can't be there to help guide that team if you're in meetings all the time. Now, I find this particular comment amusing. One of the managers that we talked to in an organization who were doing an assessment made this comment about, I'm surprised at the name Agile. It really should be called couch potato, and there are too many meetings. And then he said, it's ironic that there are all these books that explain how simple it is, which, guy's got a point, right? I mean, if something's really simple, you shouldn't need a whole lot of books to try to figure out how to do it. In fact, it's kind of not simple. I had an interesting conversation with Elizabeth Hendrickson at one point, and she was saying, some people say that Agile is an indisciplined approach, but in fact, if you're going to do it the way it really needs to be done, it requires a tremendous amount of discipline. It's, in fact, the most disciplined of all life cycle models. And I think that's true. I had a chance to talk to Alistair Cockburn about that, and he was saying, well, yes, that definitely can be a problem, and his sort of fallback, if I could summarize it, was, don't worry too much about all the different rules. Just make sure that you're getting the human elements correct. People are working together, and they'll sort out a lot of the process stuff. Which, if that's his experience with helping clients do it, then that's great. I mean, just what I've seen is that, which is, I'll talk a little more about this later, there tends to be a ritualization of some of the rules and an ignoring of some of the other rules, and then kind of this sort of excesses of one kind or another, like in meetings. And these things just happen. People are not very good necessarily at being disciplined. Now, I want to be careful about this. Talking about excessive meetings in Agile, I mean, I've certainly been in plenty of organizations that were following sequential lifecycle models that had insane amounts of meetings. I was on a project once, a sequential lifecycle project as a test manager, and we had a standing meeting every day that lasted anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. This is a single meeting, and then there would potentially be other meetings on top of that. Yeah, to say that meeting was an enervating experience is to really understate the the amount of stuffing it took out of all of us. So, this can happen in any organization, but I guess the key point here is that, Agile is certainly as prone to this risk as any other life cycle. Also, another thing I think is important, as this is a particular risk in Agile, is that you have to be careful that embrace change does not become analysis paralysis, where people say, oh, well, we're supposed to be able to change at any point, so let's go back and rediscuss and revisit things that we had discussed before. That's just inefficient in any situation. Now, obviously, if new information comes along that says we really need to revisit a decision that we made before, then by all means do that. But you do have to be careful that embracing change doesn't turn into spinning around in a circle and looking up at the sky. Now, here's another thing, leading on to the comment I made just a minute ago about, ritualizing particular rules. We have seen this, in organizations, and there are certain things, and they're very rigid about it. You propose any sort of tailoring, it's, oh, that's not Agile, we can't do that. One of them is the sprint time deadlines. They say, okay, we're going to finish a sprint every 2 weeks. By God, it's going to happen. Well, okay, that's fine, but there's also this other rule in Agile that talks about sustainable workloads, 40-hour work weeks. But what we've seen is that, for whatever reason, that particular principle doesn't tend to get ritualized anywhere near as often as our sprint time deadlines absolutely cannot change rule, which is totemic in its level of influence, which is, when combined with a lack of commitment to sustainable workload, a really negative thing potentially. So one of our clients told us about this situation where basically their project team was pushed continually to overcommit. They would commit to a velocity based on their user story sizing, a velocity that they knew they could not sustain. Because they, looking at previous projects, they knew, or previous iterations, they knew what their potential velocity was, and it wasn't that. But management would insist, by God, you have to complete all of these user stories. You have to be in this sprint. And then what happened inevitably was that stuff was done, quote unquote, done on the Friday of the last day of the sprint. But it wasn't done with testing, and so the test team would end up having to spend both days over the weekend. So this, I mean, how demotivating is that? Every other weekend, your entire weekend gets depleted by unrealistic management, essentially. The management will not accept that the velocity of the team is what it is, and that means that these user stories are going to take this long to complete. And this not only has a negative effect on testing, of course, it is also having a negative effect on the delivered quality. This is really beyond the scope of the testing team to change or to fix. It's just, it's a management maturity issue, as I say. One of the things that you could try to do to deal with it is use risk-based testing and try to de-scope some of the testing. Maybe say, look, there's these low-risk tests. These are going to get slipped into the next sprint, and if the next sprint has the same pace as this one. That'll get slipped into the next sprint as well, which basically means it'll never get done. And there's going to be an accumulation of technical debt, which of course is the natural outcome of overcommitment in any situation. I mean, the same exact thing happens in sequential life cycle models when organizations overcommit, and then in those sort of situations, the technical debt accumulates and accumulates and accumulates until you get into system test, and then it becomes an exploding problem, right? So, I mean, I guess you could say, well, I'd rather have a little crisis every other weekend than a huge crisis after 6 months of development that might kill the project, and I guess that's fair to say. But that's almost like saying I would rather hit myself really hard on my left thumb with a sledgehammer than poke a screwdriver in my eye. I mean, those aren't really choices that one should have to make. Now, sprint teams, organizational implications. Now, we've had a number of clients that have adopted Agile, and they retain an independent testing organization, and they matrix one or more testers out of that organization into each one of the sprint teams. I recommended that 4 years ago in my first presentation on this topic, and I continue to recommend it now. I think it's a very good practice to have an independent test team, have somebody out there, a test manager, whose job it is to look after the testers, to think about their long-term career development as testers, to, if necessary, stand up and say, look, we need to accept the level of risk that we're, taking by making these decisions, and not be steamrollered by extremely charismatic sprint leader, who might push through things that maybe on closer consideration wouldn't be good ideas. So, still think this is a really good idea, and very helpful, but that doesn't solve all of the siloing challenges that come up with sprints. So I want to be clear, I'm using the word silo in the sense that it's commonly used in American management terms. If you're like really perplexed as to what a silo is, and you're like, well, a silo is a big round thing in which grain is stored. What does that have to do with anything? Go and take a look on the internet and look up siloing from a management sense. But it has to do with being, in short version, blind to any challenges, priorities, tasks, activities, etc., outside your immediate area of work assignment. That's sort of the common meaning of the phrase being siloed. And so, to some extent, this is silo by design in Agile projects. We want the people on the sprint team to be very much focused on the sprint-related tasks, and to pay attention to the goals and the changing goals, and to be constantly shifting time around based on that. And that's fine. Again, if we've got that dotted line report structure and somebody's been delegated to work on the sprint, that should be what they are doing. The problem is that sometimes you get these charismatic sprint leaders that get in there and again start directing these testers, and then not keeping the test manager in the loop. Now, directing, talking and discussing and agreeing is fine, and what I'm referring to here is moving away from the sort of self-directed team idea to the sprint leader as the sole voice of authority in the team, and basically telling the tester, don't test that, test this, overriding the independent tester's judgment. So that's something that you have to be very careful about. And another thing is this issue of overtime. I talked about the every other weekend we've got to work all weekend problem. That can be something that's driven by a sprint leader that a test manager could conceivably and should step in to try to intervene and say, look, this has to stop. Another thing too is each sprint, once somebody's been put on through that sprint, that's where they are. That's the amount of effort that's available. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, that there can be a variable impact from an effort point of view, testing versus development, this can create squeezes, even if the organization's trying to keep in mind velocity if the only thing that's used when they look at velocity is the amount of effort required to develop. And if the effort required for testing is assumed to be some sort of linear percentage on top of that effort required to develop, well, that's an assumption that might hold true over a large number of stories in the aggregate, but for any given user story, it may very well not be true. So I mentioned this issue of potential loss of independence. Also, another thing is when you have all of your testers embedded in a sprint team, if all of them are there, then you don't have anybody who has the overall system level perspective. If there are like 10 or 15 sprints going on at once, who's looking at how all those things fit together? Now, a good way to do that is to have a separate team that is the system integration team, and they are testing the outputs of all of the sprints as they come together to form a coherent product, or system of systems, or whatever it is. Now that can solve the system level perspective issue. Now, but there's still another potential concern, which is gaps and overlap. You get situations potentially where there's redundancy in testing across 2 or more sprint teams. There are gaps that exist because people are assuming that something's getting tested somewhere else, such as, for example, performance, reliability, or security. So somebody has to make sure that they're looking at that, managing that. That's, again, where the independent test manager comes in. The other thing, too, is looking at the overall test system, especially the automated components of it. We have to have somebody outside of the sprint teams making sure that they're paying attention to that. Now, also, whether we have testers outside of the sprints handling some of these things that are more systemic, there is still the potential for those inside the sprints that workload is too high, and then turnover commences and morale goes down. So that is something that as a test manager you have to manage. Now, we have seen one approach to try to deal with the siloing, which is to have a development sprint and a test sprint, the test sprint coming after the development sprint. This creates a great deal of angst on the part of the Agile purists, who will just jump up and down, scream, and say that's not Agile, sometimes they call that a mini fall, and it provokes a lot of stomach acid release. And in this particular case, I would actually tend to agree that you're really just exchanging one silo for another and creating a situation where, again, technical debt accumulates and then potentially explodes into a major problem, and putting up barriers between the independent testers and the developers is not a good idea. So, I think that is something to avoid that. I'm not saying don't have stabilization sprints periodically. Those can be a very good idea. And definitely when you're talking about the system integration testing, I think that should be separated out as a separate activity, that testing with the deliverables that come out of the disparate sprint teams that are working. But still, we need to have people working within the sprints as dedicated testers there in order to fully obtain the benefits of Agile techniques. So, yeah, as I mentioned, stabilization sprints are a good idea. Make sure that the test manager is thinking about the centripetal forces to try to bind the team together. Consistent use of test management tools, for example, consistent use of automation across the different groups, skills development and skills management for the different testers to make sure that the team's capabilities are growing as one would desire. Long-term projects like automation and maybe identifying ways of using production data in testing and those sort of things are good things to have. Maybe pull somebody off of the sprint team for a while and have them on those longer-term projects for a while, especially if you trying to deal with maybe some workload-related burnout on maybe one or more of the sprint teams can be particularly bad on that way. You can use rotation, periodic rotation, to try to deal with it. Just keeping that global perspective. If there's multiple sprints going on, different product lines and being integrated together. Think about the systemic stuff, performance, reliability, security, usability, system integration, interoperability. Make sure that there are people allocated to do that. Okay, now I want to move on to something a little different. So far I've been really talking about how the practices of the different people involved in Agile and managers and so forth can affect testing, especially when Agile is not implemented in the proper fashion. I want to move on now to talking about attitude, talking about a mindset, because mindset is important here too. So the consulting organization, Gartner Group, has this thing called the hype cycle, which is just brilliant. And if you haven't ever seen it before, I'd encourage you to spend a little time on the internet taking a look at it and reading up on it. It is, if you've been in this business for any amount of time, you have definitely seen it, and you'll have this aha moment when you read it. You'll be like, oh yes, I've been there, and you'll know where you are currently. So the hype cycle talks about how ideas move through organizations. They're specifically focused on technological organizations, but I have a feeling that you could actually see this, just about any sort of sociological phenomenon. So I don't think this is technology specific, but anyway, they talk about the initial point when they call the technology trigger, and the idea first comes along and starts to get a lot of buzz, and then you enter what they call the peak of inflated expectations, which is there's a lot of publicity, there's a lot of enthusiasm, there are a lot of consultants out, training companies out there making a ton of money hyping the concept, and often closing deals, selling deals based on unrealistic expectations about how wonderful the world is going to be when everybody's Agile, in this particular case. Then next you get the trough of disillusionment, which is where people start to see that, well, we were oversold on this thing, and it doesn't actually solve all of the software engineering problems, and we still have problems, and maybe this isn't so good. And you start to get the backlash. And then at some period of time after that backlash, some of the organizations that stuck with it start to realize, oh, well, this is how you would really get maximum benefits. And then you get to the plateau of productivity, where people, it becomes part of how people work. And there's really people stop talking about we're doing Agile. It's just like, well, this is the way everybody works. Now, what we've seen with some of our clients is that you get this Agile, at the peak of inflated expectations. There's been a full-scale buy-in to the hype, the sales rhetoric. And I love this Dilbert cartoon. I mean, this was originally written back in the days when Six Sigma was the thing that was going to save everything, change the world, make technology easy and so forth. So that was a good 6 or 7 years ago, right? And you see the boss here, like, didn't you sell us that completely worthless TQM program a few years before that? Because you might remember in the 90s there was, total quality management was the peak of inflated expectations, and then the Dogbert character going, oh, this is have totally different names. And the manager is just completely beguiled by this. When can we start? So the beauty of Dilbert is, of course, that within the cynical humor is always a great, huge kernel of truth. And certainly this cartoon could, without stretching the point too much, be redrawn by simply substituting implement an Agile program as opposed to implement a Six Sigma program. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying Agile is bad and it's totally worthless and don't get any benefits out of it. That's not the point of this presentation at all. As I said just yesterday, I gave a presentation on all the interesting testing opportunities that are created by Agile. But what I'm criticizing here is this mindset of as soon as we adopt Agile, all of our problems, all of our software engineering problems are going to go away. And I can just tell from having been in a number of organizations that have adopted Agile that they're not making all the problems go away in any of the groups, and they're certainly not it doesn't make all the problems go away in testing, and it surely doesn't make the problems go away when the implementation is sort of the Chinese menu approach, where people pick some of the concepts and say, yes, we're going to ritualize those. The other stuff, like the sustainable work week, for example, we're not going to worry so much about, because then that ends up undercutting the thing as well. And if you combine that with, as I say, consultants and training companies running around saying everything's going to be great as soon as the entire world goes Agile, does not contribute to a thoughtful and realistic implementation of the technique. Unfortunately, it is what it is. The reason that this Gartner hype cycle is so brilliant is not just because it's funny. It's funny in a sort of sardonic way, because we've all seen it. If we've been around long enough, we've seen it. We know this is true. We know this happens, and it does seem to be sort of universal. We're seeing the same thing now with software as a service. Going through that same cloud. People running around talking about, you got to get a cloud. And, so this is not by any means a missile strike on Agile alone. This is a much broader issue. Now, you could say, well, so what? So what do I care if people, if people want to turn into lemmings and run around and believe things that aren't true? How does that affect me? Well, the thing is that what we've seen in some of our test teams, you've got test managers who are and test leads who are saying, well, yeah, we've got Agile, but the quality hasn't gone up, or maybe the quality's not really, maybe the quality's even lower. And we've had some reports of that. And the test team talks about some of the issues, the challenges that I've covered in this presentation, and how they're affecting their ability to do their job, and particularly getting steamrollered by change. And the test team goes to a test lead, test team goes to management, says, look, we need some help with sort of modulating some of this frenzy, and getting a little more serious about how we go about this, and understanding that this is not just a magic wand and we've now hit the project with, and therefore all of our problems are gone. See, that what can happen then is that the managers hearing that can experience what's called cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is when you're confronted with some idea or information that is at great odds with what you expected, the pattern that you were looking for. Now, when the pattern that you were looking for was set by organizations, often outside organizations, that have a great deal to gain from making managers, especially purchasing managers, believe that all of their problems are going to go away as soon as they sign the check for the big Agile training or what have you. You're now saying, no, that didn't happen, and the cognitive dissonance there can be pretty significant, and I've seen interesting reactions when managers are confronted with the fact that, hey, you signed this deal and you spent a lot of money, but you're really not getting everything out of it that you said we were going to get. What can sometimes happen, and I've seen this in a number of different contexts, and it doesn't just have to do with Agile, it has to do with managers being confronted by reality being different than their expectations, is that testing gets scapegoated. Oh, well, these problems are happening because your team is being obstructionist, your team's not adopting Agile, your team's not they're not team players, and the competence isn't there, and there are a number of ways that testers that are reporting news that people don't like get subjected to pressure, as we all know, and anybody who's been in testing a while knows this, because it doesn't just happen here, it happens with test results too. So understand that if you're experiencing these challenges that I've been talking about, and you're going to try to make people outside of the test team aware of these challenges, you have to manage your message and the way that you communicate this really carefully, because otherwise this can be something that's very destructive to the credibility, and in some cases the viability of the test team. So certainly be aware of that potential. Excuse me. So back in 2002, I was working on the second edition of Managing the Testing Process. It's now in its third edition. But Agile at that point was just starting to roll out. And I said that, as professional testers, we basically need to figure out how to fit testing within Agile methods, because, at that time, Agile was really all focused on development, and there hadn't been a lot of work on testing. And I continued to say, well, I will hope that this is going to happen by the end of the decade. Well, 2009 came and went, and certainly not all of the challenges were gone. In fact, I first did this presentation shortly before 2009. The challenges are still there, and when I updated this, those of you who might have heard this original presentation will say, well, that's mostly the same stuff, and it is. There's still a lot of challenges. Now, there's a lot of opportunities too, so I don't want to come across as negative and saying Agile doesn't work. That's not the message at all. This presentation has been focused on the challenges and managing those, how to be effective within those challenges, and that is, of course, necessarily, anytime you focus on challenges and risks and negative outcomes that can occur, it can come across as a little negative, but that's not the point. My point here is to make sure that we deal with the challenges and deal more effectively than we have, really, as professionals in general, to start to really enjoy all of the opportunities that exist in Agile. And I do want to re-emphasize something, and I said at the outcome, or at the outset, which is, that by choosing the proper strategies, this can definitely help us better position us to support the goals of Agile and the way that Agile works. So, using risk-based testing, and again, when I say risk-based testing, I mean risk-based testing as I would define it, say, managing the testing process, or any of the articles or webinars you'll find on my website, not necessarily as how others would define it. That definitely works in terms of increasing quality and productivity and flexibility. The proper use of automated regression strategies, definitely critical in terms of the regression risk that's associated with the following an Agile approach. And then incorporating the right amount of reactive testing to make sure that you plug the gaps in the risk-based testing and the automated testing, so that your testing is as complete as it can be. So we get the strategies in place, then we need to continue to work with people in the Agile community to try to figure out how to better fit testing into Agile life cycles. And it can be done. A number of our clients are experiencing a lot of success, and we do have clients for whom these challenges, to the extent that they exist, are being effectively managed and are certainly more than offset by the opportunities and benefits that are created by Agile. So there is hope. Again, I don't want to come across as negative in this presentation, just realistic and emphasizing the need to confront these challenges head on and solve them. Okay, so that's the presentation proper. As usual, I will put up the advertisement here while I get the question pane undocked, and the sometimes painful question pane. There we go. Oops, that's painful right now. Just stopped doing what it was supposed to be doing. Okay. Let's see. Excuse me for just 1 second. I still... okay. Well, let's see if we can make this work. No. Pardon me. I'm having some problems with Citrix here. Let's see if this will actually regain its sanity. It is not going to regain its sanity. How strange. Seems to be my week for having Citrix issues. I had a problem with it yesterday, and it's Now it seems to be wanting to do that again. In this case, it's actually even worse. Bear with me for just one moment while I try to get this fixed. Wow, that's remarkable. Okay. All right, that's now okay. It's got treated to a display of bulkiness here, but okay. The question from Gary, you opened the call talking about testing metrics. Is that a new book, a paper, or something else? It is a book, testing metrics book that I wrote. It is available as an ebook. You can get it on our website, rbcs-us.com. Go out to the store and go to the ebook section. You'll find it there. It's available in both EPUB and Kindle format, so check it out. You might find it useful. Vasavi asks, what do you think is the priority of test documentation details like test cases in Agile methodology? So that's an excellent question, and I mean, I think what you have to keep in mind here is that issue of, what is sufficient documentation. The other important thing is, things are going to change, and if you spend a lot of time writing very detailed test cases, you're going to lose a lot of that time maintaining those test cases as well. And since you're in a process of almost continual test execution, any amount of documentation that you do is inevitably associated with doing less testing. It's important that you have very lightweight test documentation, which has an interesting implication on the skills required in the test team. So in general, in a Agile world, the testers are going to need to have a higher level of skill than you might be able to get along with in a sequential lifecycle model, because in a sequential lifecycle model, you would have time available to write down detailed test cases that lower skilled testers might be able to run. In an Agile world, you simply won't have that luxury, and you're not going to be able to do that unless you, of course, throw an enormous amount of resource at it. And even then, keeping the test up to date would be such it'd be like sweeping the beach. You'd be constantly behind the curve, and there'd be a lot of false positives and false negatives coming out of that. So really, you do have to have that higher level of skill. Let's see. Adam says, thanks again, RBCS, for hosting these great webinars. You are quite welcome, Adam. He says, where is the conference? I assume he's talking about the STP conference. That will be in Miami, and it's in October. I forget the exact date, but if you go to stpcon.com, you'll be able to find it. So I hope to see you there, Adam. So let's see. Douglas says, hi, Rex. I always had an impression that Agile is designed to solve time in project development. I think he meant save time in project development. For example, the dev team will deliver system in pieces, but for the testing team, I do not see any reduction or time savings. It seems to me we have to work more once our testing scope will be changing all the time. It impacts updates in test plans, test cases, test scripts, etc. Okay, so I guess your point is that it might make the programming more efficient but make the testing less efficient. Well, it would seem to me that if there's a lot of thrashing around, a lot of change that involves revisiting decisions that have been made before, that the efficiency hits would actually be as painful on the programmer side as they would be on the tester side. And that was what I was talking about earlier in the presentation about avoiding analysis paralysis. I think in that circumstance, if you're making a lot of change, then you're just going to have inefficiencies across the board. I think if you're operating in an Agile world and you're seeing that every other group, BAs, developers, project management, etc., is happy with Agile and achieving good efficiency gains, and you as the test manager are the only one who's not happy and you're seeing your efficiency go down, do some careful analysis of why exactly that's happening. Now, it could be that a bad implementation of Agile is causing you to suffer excruciatingly from the challenges that I mentioned. But it could also be that you've chosen improper testing strategies, such as wanting to be very much doing analytical requirements-based testing, which, as I said, is something that's, if you follow a rigid type of approach to that, a la, say, Rick Craig's book, Systematic Software Testing, then you could easily find yourself in a situation where you are suffering the problem that you're talking about, Douglas. It's just you're spending a ton of time redoing work that had already been done. That gets to the question that was brought up before about level of documentation. Certainly, if we try to follow, say, the IEEE 829 standard and document rigorously in great detail, we're probably going to find that from an efficiency point of view in an Agile world that we're really getting it in the teeth. Let's see. Brian says, during many webinars, I've heard the term test oracle. Can you elaborate on what a test oracle is? Is it the story, the intended outcome? Is it derived from the intent of the requirement, etc.? So, Brian, a test oracle is any source of information that we can consult to determine whether the test has passed or failed. In other words, to determine the expected result of a particular test condition that we might create or check out. User stories can be a test oracle. Legacy systems can be a test oracle. Marketing information that your company publishes on your website can be a test oracle. User documentation can be a test oracle. Your common sense can and should be a test oracle. So you should have a number of test oracles available to you. This was the sort of the critique I was making back at that slide when I was talking about test oracles and why a purely requirements-based approach is not a very good strategy typically, because in a purely requirements-based approach, testers rely 100% on the requirement specification as a test oracle, and most of our clients, the degree of documentation that they provide in a user story is just not up to bearing that weight. So we need to have other oracles in addition to the requirements. Manaka asks how to deal with version control of documentation in Agile testing. Well, keep it lightweight, definitely. If you're using some kind of test management system, then hopefully that test management system has the ability to do some amount of change tracking. If not, then you can use a configuration management system to do that. Probably best not to consider a test case, quote-unquote, done until the end of the sprint in which that test case was developed. In other words, you don't lock it down and put it under configuration management until that point, because otherwise I think you're going to be sort of caught in a configuration management hell situation where you're updating, bumping minor version numbers on a document 3 to 4 times a day, and it's likely to be frustrating. And it gets back to what I was talking about before, is that you're finding that you're very inefficient and everybody else is being more efficient because of Agile. And certainly one of the things you should look at is how your practices might be crossways with Agile principles. Bhavini asks, does sprint term mean the changes which are happening are only happening once? That's how it was explained to me by a BA previously, so I wanted to confirm. Well, I think what you're asking is are the changes introduced basically in the batch of user stories that are brought forward and agreed upon for a particular sprint, and then things remain stable within that sprint. The next window for change is the beginning of the next sprint, etc. Yeah, I think in some organizations they would say, yes, this is the way that we do things, and that we don't make changes during the sprints. But I think what I have seen with a lot of my clients is that actually change is something that's allowed to happen during the sprints as well, which would get to the point that I was making before when I was talking about getting swamped by change. If that is happening, there definitely needs to be a way of keeping the test team in the loop on that, and not just in the loop, but also able to participate in decision making about what changes are and are not made. Because it'd be very easy for the test team to be totally overwhelmed by change in those sort of situations. Pramatha asks, are you planning on sharing the slides later? So Pramatha, you must have missed the opening few minutes. The slides are always available on the basic library. You go to rbcs-us.com, navigate to the resources tab in the upper middle, and then from there navigate to the basic library, and from there you will find the slides. Chris says, can you elaborate on what you mean by embedding testers in sprint teams? Are you suggesting testers be moved in and out of a specific team between sprints? No. Well, for one thing, for most of our clients that are doing Agile, there is no between sprints. I mean, the thing that's between a sprint is a weekend. In some cases, it's not even that. The sprint deadlines are set up to be that, like, the sprint ends on Tuesday and the next sprint starts Wednesday, so there's no between sprints. But if you're saying move people around from one sprint to the next, no, that's not what I would recommend either, because you want the sprint teams to develop some team cohesion and some synergies and strengths as a team. There's that project management thing about forming, storming, norming, and performing, where you're forming a team, and then the storming is that the various disagreements get aired out and cause conflict, and then the norming is that those disagreements get resolved, and then the team enters a performing phase. And if you're moving people around from one sprint team to the next every sprint, then you're introducing an element of continuously reforming and, of course, restorming within the sprint teams. Now, I do think that some amount of rotation periodically probably makes sense. You'd have to figure out how frequently that would be, because that helps spread good ideas and practices around cross-pollination. But I would say avoid doing that too frequently, that you introduce disruption into the team. And, of course, there's a big credibility issue, too. Person's initially put onto a sprint team, they're not going to have a lot of credibility with the other members of the team that are used to working together. They're going to look at the test guys like, well, okay, this is all well and good, but this person has to sort of prove their worth, make their bones, as the saying goes. So Jitender says, my question is, how is Agile testing successful where a QA team has nothing to say and acting as an independent test team and sitting in some different geographical location and time zone? Okay. So first what I'll do, since I've gotten so much mileage out of listening to Alistair Cockburn's talk over the weekend, I'm going to quote him on this again. He talked about going into a situation in an organization where, they were saying, well, can we do Agile? And the first question he asked is, can you co-locate your people on the Agile sprint teams? And they said no. And he said, well, then nothing else matters. You can't do it. So, there you have one of the sort of the founders, if you will, the original signatories of the signators, I guess, of the Agile Manifesto, saying what you're describing, Jitender, cannot be Agile. That since you're talking about a situation where part of the team, in this case the testers, are often an independent and often in a separate part of the world, that's just definitionally, according to Cockburn, not Agile. Now, again, back to the point I was making at the very beginning of this presentation of there's Agile as the 10 or 20 people that signed the Agile Manifesto intended it to be, and there's Agile as actually practiced in the real world. And you're now living in that gulf between the intended concept of Agile and what Agile often is in the real world. And you are not alone in that gulf, Jitender. We have plenty of clients in this exact situation. It's extremely problematic because in Agile, you're talking about things like face-to-face communication. Well, that's extremely difficult when you're separated by time zone differences. Judging, since your name is Jitender, I'm going to guess that perhaps you might be in India. Yeah, I mean, you're 12 hours off time zone-wise, and that's that's a real issue because there is no common work hour in that situation. Now, organizations try to deal with that by having people co-located in North America or Europe, wherever the work is going on, or they try to deal with it by doing, what's called nearshoring. Like, for example, in Europe, they do a lot of development in Eastern Europe and in North America. Brazil and Latin America are becoming popular destinations because at least the time zone thing isn't there. But still, geographical separation is a powerful force and not a force for good on projects. There's been plenty of studies done over the years of how much just separating people by a couple walls reduces the amount of communication they do. And then if you put them on separate floors, they might as well be on different sides of the moon. So, I guess the only thing that can be done here is to recognize the communication barriers that are going to be created by this and try to introduce mitigating forces that promote more and more frequent communication between these disparate elements. And to overcome the necessary damage that's done to the Agile approach by that geographical separation. So let's see, we have Keith Hamilton. Hey Keith, good to see you again. This is not a question but more of a comment. As a QA manager, one of the main testing challenges I have found with Agile is the difficulty in incorporating team members who have what they consider true Agile in their previous experience. Amen to that. They are often more contentious, less collaborative, and I often hear remarks like, that's not Agile or that's mini waterfall. These statements are intended to indicate something bad on our part, but ultimately they are not constructive, and really all they say to me is, I don't like the way you are doing it. And I am a manager who overwhelmingly prefers the Agile approach. Now that is, Keith, that was an absolutely brilliant comment, and if these weren't free webinars, I'd pay you for having said that. That is just really just totally hits the nail on the head. That is, it exactly encapsulates one issue that I have with Agile, which I didn't get into too much, or is sort of inherent in that hype curve thing of just this. And this is not everybody, so I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but you do tend to run into some real dogmatists, like what you're describing here, Keith, that just take all the fun out of dysfunctional. They just are constantly hitting you up with these guilt trips about how you're not doing it right, and you don't understand Agile, and I understand Agile, and so forth. There's always tailoring involved, and certainly, there's also, I think, a need that everybody play the hand they're dealt within an organization. The other thing that's ironic about it, of course, is that kind of behavior, that kind of dogmatism, that kind of accusatory, you're not doing this right, and I know better than you, from almost anybody in an organization, with the possible exception of a CEO, that kind of behavior is more likely to provoke the opposite of the intended reaction, the intended response, than anything else that one could come up with, because it's totally, if you look into how people relate to other people, there's that whole parent-child-adult metaphor for that. It's called ego state communication, and that's just totally a parent-child communication there. Basically, that the person saying that is in the ego state of parent, and they're trying to push you into the ego state of child and say you're not doing this right, and then the reaction that's going to be provoked by that is, at best, sort of a tolerant chuckle and, gee, it isn't she or he cute when he gets like that, but more likely it's going to be something along the lines of, hey, forget you, and don't come up to me with that attitude. So I'd say, if you're dealing with people like that, probably the most effective way is to say something along the lines of, you know, if the response that you're trying to get is to convince us to more closely follow the Agile principles, you're much more likely to get that response by helping us get there rather than criticizing that we're not there. So again, Keith, thanks for the great comment. I just love that. Okay, Dwight says, Rex, I liked your comment early on that in testing we have to play the hand we're dealt. There definitely is a gap that exists between Agile theory and Agile practice. Does an overall project success basically depend on the quality of the people and how they adapt the theory to their specific needs? Yeah, that's another great thought, Dwight. Really true. And particularly Agile, I think, you know, because Agile is so much postulated on, you know, people factors and promoting people factors over documentation and you know, heavyweight process and all of those kinds of things. You know, definitely it should be, you know, we rely on smart people doing the right things, and you know, that again is kind of one of the ironies of the gap between Agile theory and Agile practice is that sometimes the Agile practice ignores the centrality of the people, and as I said, you know, before, ritualizes some parts of the rules and ignores others. But you know, it is what it is, and as I said, you know, you do play the hand you're dealt. So do that. You know, unless you just decide I do not want to play this hand, and then, you know, I can't stand the way that Agile is being implemented here, or I can't stand Agile, then, you know, go somewhere else. You know, but certainly being like the person that Keith was describing before, standing around throwing rocks and saying that's not Agile, or you know, the other side of standing around throwing rocks and say Agile sucks and I don't understand why we're doing this and this is stupid. You know, if the organization is committed to following Agile, either do your best to make that succeed, you know, as Dwight says, or you know, find something else to do with your time. Joe Green, who's unfortunately has left, made an interesting comment. He says, having been involved in multiple quote-unquote Agile projects, to me they all boil down to extreme waterfall for testers. Sounds like he was reacting to my comment about the whole, you know, spending the weekend catching up for the accumulated technical debt throughout the sprint. So yeah, it's not the only person to have experienced that. Let's see. I want to make sure that I give some other people a chance to jump in here. Anna says, co-location is essential in Agile. Doesn't it break the mindset of QA and development teams? QA starts thinking from development perspective and vice versa. Okay, so that's an interesting point. And you know, this is something that I was discussing a couple days ago. I was doing a risk-based testing course with some folks at Hewlett-Packard, and we were talking about this separation of testers and, you know, testers understanding how the software is built and so forth. And you know, I made this comment that it's really better for testers to know how things are built because you know, if that's not the case, then testing would be one of the few professions in the world where ignorance was actually something that you would want in the person. And I said, it can't be. And one of the people said, well, I get your point, but at the same time, isn't it possible that if people understand how the software is built, they will accept certain misbehaviors as inherent in the design or the implementation? And that's really, I refer to that as acclimatization, and that actually can happen even amongst people who are not technical. And what it is if you see a certain type of misbehavior, you sort of become acclimatized to it, and you start to go, oh yeah, well, you know, that happens. The important thing, Anna, is that whether we're sitting side by side with developers or we're working around the world from them, whatever life cycle we're working in, we've got to preserve that mindset of we need to think about how this looks from the user's perspective, right? If a user or customer would say that's defective behavior, then we need to be ready to say that's defective behavior, regardless of what a user story or legacy system or other test oracle tells us. So I think the important thing here is more of a philosophical thing rather than a locational thing. And it doesn't matter where you sit; it matters where your head is at. more than anything else. So Jonathan says, Kristen Artist says hi. Tell Chris hi for me. Thank you. Let's see. Sarah asks, can you elaborate on what happens during a periodic stabilization sprint? Well, what would happen is a lot of testing, often, well, ideally, not just functional testing, but also non-functional testing, security, reliability, performance, say usability as well, though certainly usability should not be only addressed at that point, but systemic types of behaviors. And a real focus on fixing defects and driving down technical debt. Now, the Agile purists will just jump up and down about these stabilization sprints. Say, that's not Agile, that's mini waterfall. And but you know, I mean, a lot of our clients are finding they do have to make this part of their practice, and it works fine. You know, obviously you can't get to the point of digging yourself into such a deep hole that you don't have time during the stabilization sprints to dig yourself out. That's something that you would definitely want to avoid. But you know, you just want to say, okay, we've accumulated a little more technical debt than we really ought to live with, and let's get rid of it. Kelly says, can you suggest an approach to get developers to adopt an automated unit testing strategy? What is the benefit to them? Oh, good. Yeah, so always when you're trying to get somebody to do something, don't talk about how it's going to help solve your pain. Talk about how it's going to help solve their pain. So the benefit to automated unit testing to the developer is that instead of this long and public and potentially drawn-out process of resolving a defect that has been discovered during independent testing, the defects that they have introduced, and you know, they need to understand that they are going to introduce defects. The defects that they have introduced can be quickly, efficiently, and privately removed by the developers. So, you know, I guess the key there, Kelly, would be to think about what parts of independent testing and detection of defects cause pain for the developers. And many times it's the issue of this being made public, and you know, there's a certain amount of, and this shouldn't happen, but there's a certain amount of perception of, oh, you know, the developers that have quote unquote too many bugs in their code aren't good developers. You know, that may be their sensitivity here, and so, you know, you can kind of leverage that, but figure out where the pain point is and try to help use that to motivate change. Let's see. Andy says, can you speak to the need to balance new feature testing and regression testing? How to maintain enough of each? That's a huge issue, Andy. I think this is definitely one of the reasons why I was talking about having the support for the regression testing framework being outside of the sprints and really focusing on automation and trying to have a really efficient automation framework, because otherwise you are going to get into exactly this bind in that, you know, the set of features needing to be regression tested will increase linearly with each sprint, yet your available resource from a test point of view generally remains constant across each sprint. And so and also because of the constant change to the code base that's happening, the regression risk continues to go up as the number of features that are present goes up. So it's not like, well, regression risk is just contained to those features that were changed that have been built in the previous sprint. The regression risk goes up across all of the features. So it's a real challenge to maintain that, or to manage that regression risk under any circumstances. And then you add in there, and oh, by the way, we still have to maintain the desired velocity of new feature development. And you know, this creates a situation where potentially the testers could just be tearing out their hair. So the key here is twofold. One is upstream defect detection and removal. This means automated unit tests. This means ideally static code analysis integrated into the automated unit testing framework. This means continuous integration. This means use of functional acceptance test tools such as fitness, and that also being built into the continuous integration framework. Basically, a lot of upstream stuff trying to contain regression risk as much as possible in the development process, and then some sort of super maintainable testing, functional regression testing, possibly at the graphical user interface layer, but also possibly below that too, if you can't make it maintainable at the graphical user interface layer, to try to keep that regression risk to a minimum, because otherwise this just can absolutely eat you alive. Now, I'm afraid that we have exhausted our time for today's session. There's still some questions left. If you're interested in having those questions discussed on the blog, you can send them to info@rbcs-us.com, and I'll try to tackle those over the next week or so. Again, that's info@rbcs-us.com. So to wind the session down, a quick note about some of the free resources available from RBCS. You're aware of these free webinar sessions. You can sign up at rbcs-us.com. If you want a webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or any other topic related to software testing, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com. Let us know what we can do for you. You can sign up for our free newsletter at rbcs-us.com as well. So it gets you valuable discounts on consulting and training services and the regular newsletter. We're at RBCS on Twitter, and we're also on Facebook, RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple days, because you could be the lucky winner of a free e-learning course. We'll be announcing that on our Twitter and Facebook feeds, as well as via email when selected. Again, the blog, rbcs-us.com/blog. You can take a look at stuff that's previously there, post comments, or email a topic that you'd like to discuss with me. Please include the word blog in the subject line so that we know how to find it. And then you can check out our digital library. Recordings of these webinars, podcasts, and videos can be found there. You can subscribe to the podcasts on iTunes, enter RBCS podcasts into the search string. You can see videos and recorded podcasts on the RBCS channel on YouTube. We offer these free resources as a service to the software testing community, because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. That concludes the webinar. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you on future webinars.